Hi, this is Sable Schultz, she, her pronouns, manager of the transgender services at the Center on Colfax, and today I am here with Dylan Edwards, he, him pronouns, correct?
Right.
And you are an author and illustrator for queer and trans comics. Tell us a little bit about some of the titles that you created.
Well, I just randomly happened to have a stack of books down here. Isn't
Yeah.
that? Um, so the most recent thing I put out was the third issue of my mini comic Cat Person, and
Hmm.
Cat is an acronym that I came up with for queer, asexual, and trans. So these are all autobio comics about. It also is a really great Scrabble word, but it it is the actual Scrabble word is like an addictive substance. So that's
Oh,
not.
okay.
This is queer, asexual, and trans comics. So anyway, that's what those things all are.
Well,
So that's auto.
as a
Sorry,
sometimes comic reader myself, I can say that comics can be very addictive substance, right?
that's and I have no problem with that. So I do a lot of different genres. So that's autobio comics about
Mhm.
those specific topics. I also do uh, queer and trans sci-fi and fantasy. That's this series here, Valley
Oh,
of the Sky. Perhaps of heightened interest right now, given a certain high profile fantasy author who decided to go on a massive anti trans rant. So if you
yeah.
would like fantasy series that is very explicitly queer and trans and has queerness canonically in the story and not something the author had to tell you about later,
Hmm.
and that includes trans characters who are not vilified and treated
Hmm.
as horrible people, you
Hmm.
should check out Valley of the Silk Sky, my webcomic.
Definitely. Yeah.
And I have obviously print volumes of that.
Hmm.
And probably the thing that people most know me for is this right here, Transposes, which is my first real book, which was about queer identified trans masculine people.
Hmm.
And so this is all nonfiction. So these are people I
Hmm.
interviewed and adapted their stories into comics.
Oh, neat.
And then these are kind of other things that I've done that started their lives as uh, this was an editorial cartoon I did for a queer newspaper. Obviously, those don't exist anymore. This was my first web comic, Politically Incorrect, and then this was another web comic I did that's queering sports.
Hmm.
So, uh,
Oh,
so
fun.
those are some of my. These are older works of mine, but obviously I also have those in print format for people who
Hmm.
are interested in that sort of a thing.
Awesome. And how did you get into doing comic illustration and comic writing?
It's something that I had wanted to do for a long time. I started like when I was a little kid. I would make illustrated books,
Hmm.
and I like my parents would bring home reams of printer paper, the kind that had like the strips on the side for
Yeah.
the to roll through the little toothed
The
wheel thing.
tractor feed. Hmm.
Yeah, and those things like because like anyway I ended up with all of this paper that was not usable in a printer because of the style of the printer at the time, so I would fold them in half and make little books and then just illustrate these books that I usually made up as I went along. I didn't have a complete story, so that's kind of where I started thinking in terms like pairing words and pictures together.
Oh, neat.
um, and then as like an 8-year old I tried to do my own newspaper comic strip.
Hmm.
um, I never sent off to any newspapers. They were just little pencil drawings. So that was, just some stuff that I worked on. In a more professional sense, I started thinking about it more seriously in college when I was working at a comic shop and I was kind of studying comics as a medium more seriously and taking art classes and kind of interacting with some of my professors who actually looked at comics as an art form rather than like a trash genre that
Hmm.
only no real artist would work in comics. So I started working on some short pieces around that time, and then after college I actually started submitting things for publication and starting to get more actual professional work going.
Hmm. What is so? I'm going to show my age a little bit. My relation with the comic industry was kind of late '80s, early '90s, and I was picking up a lot of like independent comics. So the idea that comics are not a literary form is kind of like astounding to me because I saw a lot of these. I'm curious, what is the state of independent comics today?
Honestly, especially when we're talking about queer and trans
Mm-hmm.
themes, independent comics has some of the best material out there.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of mainstream publishers are playing catch up on this because
Mm-hmm.
we were shut out. Like you no mainstream publisher is going to publish something with overtly queer themes in it for the
Mm-hmm.
most part. So people went into self-publishing and webcomics and so on and so forth, and have been putting out phenomenal work over the last
Mm-hmm.
several years. So honestly, like the stuff that's on my shelf that I tend to recommend to people most enthusiastically is stuff that was published because they ran a successful Kickstarter and self-published it.
Yeah.
So you're starting to see mainstream presses catch up to that, but they're still a little bit behind the curve of what has been already happening
Mm-hmm.
in self-published and independent queer and trans comics. So there's some really good stuff out there.
Mm-hmm. And these your little pins, they're examples of some of your illustration. Can you move in a little?
Yeah. Yes, like this little space cat and this single-celled cat and this bat over. You might have noticed I kind of live in a Halloween world
Mm-hmm.
24/7. Um, so these pins are my own designs. So
Mm-hmm.
I do drawings. In fact, I'll show you some. These are my Patreon. These are actually Patreon postcards that I
Oh,
send out
nice.
to people who pledge to my Patreon. But I do like these are kind of extemporaneous. Like I don't think about them too much. I just do little illustrations
Mm-hmm.
of things and send them to people. Like whatever. Like here's an
Oh.
owl. Um, so if you pledge $5 to me on Patreon, I'll send you a postcard every month.
Mm-hmm.
But some of like the space cat and the bat both started out as Patreon postcards. So I
Mm-hmm.
just refined the art a little bit more, and then sent it out to a like a shop that does pen design, and got enamel pins made of these things. So that's one way that it happens. I do more formal illustrations as well, but these
Mm-hmm.
were things where it's like, oh, I really like this illustration and I want to do something else with it. So,
Awesome. What are some of the takeaways that you hope that folks take away from some of your work?
so a lot of my stuff is focused more on connecting with queer and trans readers rather than trying to explain queerness or transness to straight cis people. Like I
Mm-hmm.
figure, I hope that they enjoy it, but I'm not trying to communicate with them because I often find like when you're first coming out you might consume a lot of that sort of thing of like just
Mm-hmm.
explain transness to me, but at
Mm-hmm.
some point after you've been out for a while you're just like, what, can I just have like a fantasy story or a sci-fi story where the characters are
Right.
queer and trans and it's not about identity issues and coming
Mm-hmm.
outness, like like some of us have been out for a long time and we're like, yes, these stories are important, but I need other
Mm-hmm.
things as well.
Right.
So part of it is I want to connect with readers who are looking for that kind of thing. But part of it too, like especially with Valley of the Silk Sky, which is written for teen and up
Mm-hmm.
readers, is I also want straight cis teens to read it and engage with the material, but with the point of view of like some people in their friends group
Mm-hmm.
are going to be queer and trans. And so whether or not they already know that their friends are out, they will have examples of protagonists in fiction to kind of get them used to the idea that queer and trans teens exist and to be accepting of that. And honestly, my experience with people in that age group has been that they do already have friends who are queer
Mm-hmm.
and trans, or know people at school, or friend of a friend or whatever, or are themselves queer and trans and need something that is relatable to this new world where it's not like this is siloed into only adults get to be queer, only adults get to be trans.
Right. 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 And Any thoughts on what you might recommend or tell other LGBTQ author, illustrators, people creating comics or starting out on a similar path as your own? Any thoughts or advice you would pass on to them?
I would say to focus on doing the things that bring you the most excitement. Like, don't necessarily chase after a trend because the world is changing so fast and our cultural dialogue is changing so fast that if you're like, the hot thing right now is this, so I'll go spend a year or two
Mhm.
or three working on a book. By the time it gets around to that, it's like we've already moved on to another conversation. So find a way to talk about something that is very important to you and meaningful to you, and don't worry as much about what you think uh, the market needs, I suppose I would say.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that will also give the work the most weight if it's something that's very
Mhm.
personally important to you.
I think so too. I think.
And yeah, and there are a lot of like publishing itself is kind of in a massive state of change right now too.
Mhm.
So any advice that someone gave you even like 5 years ago for how to get published is already outdated. Um, and also, like, I mean, who knows what's going to happen with we are currently living through a pandemic, which has closed a
Mhm.
lot of shops, and a lot of publishers are figuring out how they're going to adjust to a world where bookstores are maybe not a central focus right now for how the work is getting out there. Like, no authors are doing book tours right
Right.
now. And what does it mean to try to find readers? And what does it mean to try to engage readers when a lot of people are feeling weird about unfamiliar material? Like, this is
Mhm.
kind of a psychological phenomenon where people tend to retreat into things that have already seen, have already read,
Mhm.
because it reduces your anxiety because
Mhm.
you already know what's going to happen, so you're not there like anxious like, oh no. But what does that mean for underrepresented writers who need to reach people who haven't read them before? Like, how do you reach people in a time when people are having a hard time even wanting to look at new material? So this is
Mhm.
all stuff we're trying to figure out right now, and I don't know the answer to that. um, and I'm not sure anyone has said, aha, I've figured it out, I've unlocked the key. So so I can say, like, here are some things to focus on, but also be aware of the fact that everything is in flux and we don't really
Mhm.
know what's going to happen next.
Mhm.
But I will say right now, a lot of publishers, like, if you were to submit a book to a publisher, it wouldn't come out this year anyway. Like,
Mhm.
for traditional book publishing, the lead time is at least a year out from the moment your manuscript is finished to the
Mhm.
time it actually is going to be published. So a lot of publishers are like, okay, 2020 is probably going to be a little bit of a mess and a wash, but we need 2021, might be different 2022. Hopefully
Right.
the world will be more conducive. So it's still be looking to try to find an agent, but be aware that nobody knows what's going on right now. But publishers are still thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. So
So it
so
sounds
it's
like
not necessarily like a
you're saying keep creating, create what you love, and don't worry about what it's going to look like next year because we have no clue. So
correct. Correct.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Dylan, and thank you to the viewers at home. And remember that we have links to Dylan's work, our own donation page. Please remember to like and subscribe, and hit the notification icon. Thank you. It was good speaking with you, Dylan.
Thank you very much.